His hands were steady. That was the first thing anyone should have noticed. 78 years old, fingers wrapped around a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum, and his hands were absolutely steady. But nobody was looking at his hands. They were too busy laughing. What those young shooters didn't know about the old man in lane 12 would silence every single one of them before the day was over. Some men don't need technology to prove what they're worth. Type respect. If you believe skill earned over decades beats gadgets bought last weekend. His name was Arthur Devereux. Most people at the Cedar Ridge Rifle and Pistol Club had never seen him before. He showed up on a Saturday morning in mid-October, the kind of morning where the air bites just enough to remind you summer is gone. He drove a truck older than half the competitors, parked it at the far end of the lot, and walked toward the registration table carrying a rifle case that had more patches and wear marks than a road atlas. He moved slowly, not from weakness, from patience. There's a difference, and if you knew what to look for, you could see it in the way he planted each step, the way his eyes swept the range before his body followed. Old habits, the kind that keep you alive. The Cedar Ridge Fall Classic was the biggest amateur competition in the county. 3 stages, 50 shooters, and a trophy that meant more to the guys who showed up every year than any of them would admit. The parking lot was full of late-model trucks with custom bumper stickers and rifle cases that cost more than Arthur's monthly pension. Spotting scopes, ballistic calculators, rangefinders that could tell you the temperature of the air between you and the target. The technology on display could have outfitted a small military unit. Arthur set his case on the table and unzipped it. The woman running registration, Pam, glanced down and then glanced again. Inside was an M1 Garand, not a reproduction, not a collector's piece kept in a glass case. A service rifle, blued steel worn silver at the edges, a walnut stock that had been refinished at least twice, but still showed a gouge near the trigger guard that no amount of sanding would ever remove, and on top of it nothing, no scope, no red dot, no magnification of any kind, just iron sights. The original post and aperture that came standard when this rifle rolled off the Springfield Armory line more than half a century ago. Pam looked at Arthur. "You're shooting the open division?" "If you'll have me." She handed him his lane assignment, lane 12, far end of the line. He thanked her, picked up his case, and walked toward the firing positions. That's when the first comment came. A group of 4 younger men, mid-30s, were setting up in lanes 8 through 11. They had matching team shirts, custom bolt actions with chassis systems, bipods that cost more than most car payments, and optics that could count the stitches on a baseball at 600 yards. One of them, a guy named Cody Mercer, saw Arthur walking past and nudged his buddy. "Hey, Grandpa, muzzleloader range is next week." His friends laughed. Not cruel, exactly. The way people laugh when they think they're being clever and don't realize they're being small. Arthur didn't respond, didn't look over, just kept walking. Set his case down at lane 12 and began unpacking with the precision of a man who had done this exact sequence 10,000 times. Case open, rifle out, bore check, ammunition laid in a neat row, 8-round clips, each one loaded with the same careful attention. The shooter in lane 13, a younger woman named Dana, watched him for a moment. "That's a beautiful rifle," Arthur looked up. The faintest hint of something warm crossed his face. "She's been with me a long time." "Iron sights at 300 yards. "Only way I know." Dana nodded and went back to her own setup. She had a modern precision rifle with a scope that probably cost $4,000. But she had the good sense not to question someone else's tools. The first stage was at 200 yards, 10 rounds, best group wins. The competitors settled into their positions. Arthur lowered himself to the prone position in a way that made his age visible for just a moment. His knees protested. His left shoulder settled with the kind of deliberate adjustment that comes from knowing exactly where your body doesn't work the way it used to. But once he was down, once his cheek found the stock and his eye found the rear aperture, something changed. The trembling vanished. The age vanished. What remained was geometry. Pure geometry. The relationship between his eye, the front sight post, and a target 200 yards downrange. The range officer called the line hot. 50 rifles cracked in staggered sequence. Through their scopes, the younger shooters could see their impacts immediately. They made adjustments. They consulted their ballistic apps. They dialed turrets with the confidence of people who trust their equipment to do the thinking. Arthur fired 8 rounds, steady, unhurried. The ping of each empty clip ejecting from the Garand was a sound most people on that line had only heard in old war movies. Between shots, he didn't check anything, didn't adjust anything. He just breathed, settled, and pressed the trigger again. When the targets came back, Cody's group crowded around their results. Good scores. Sub-MOA groups from rifles built to deliver exactly that. They were pleased. Then someone looked at the scoreboard where the range officers were posting results by lane number. Lane 12. Group size, 1.4 inches. All 8 rounds inside a circle you could cover with $50, at 200 yards, with iron sights. Cody stared at the board. That's a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. The second stage moved to 300 yards. This is where optics matter most, where magnification separates the serious shooters from the casual ones. At 300 yards, a human eye looking through iron sights sees a front post that's wider than the target's center ring. You're not aiming at a precise point anymore. You're trusting muscle memory, breath control, and decades of understanding what your rifle does when you do everything right. Most modern shooters have never tried it. They don't have to. Technology solved that problem for them. But Arthur Devereux came from a time when the problem wasn't solved, when you solved it yourself, or you didn't come home. He settled into position again. Same routine, same patience, same absolute stillness once the rifle found his shoulder. Around him, the other shooters were making careful adjustments, dialing elevation, checking wind flags, consulting range cards they'd prepared the night before with software that calculated everything from altitude to barrel temperature. Arthur looked at the wind flags once, barely a glance. Then he loaded a clip and began firing. What nobody understood, what nobody could see from the outside, was what was happening behind his eyes. 53 years of trigger time, not range time, trigger time. The kind that starts before dawn in places where the targets shoot back. The kind where a missed shot doesn't cost you points, it costs someone their life. Arthur's brain had been calculating ballistic solutions since before these young men were born. He didn't need software because he was the software. Every wind call he'd ever made, every correction, every round fired in training and in combat had written itself into his nervous system like code into a machine. The iron sights weren't a limitation. They were an extension of him. The scores posted. Lane 12, 300 yards. Group size, 2.1 inches, 8 rounds. Iron sights. In a competition where the best scoped rifles were printing groups between 1.5 and 2.5 inches, a man with no optics had just matched or beaten most of the field. The murmuring started. People walked past lane 12 and looked. Some just stared at the rifle. Others looked at Arthur, who was quietly cleaning his bore between stages, and tried to figure out who he was. One of Cody's teammates, a guy named Travis, walked over. "Hey man, that's some impressive shooting," Arthur nodded. "Appreciate it." "You military?" Arthur paused. "Not long, just enough." "A while ago? What did you shoot?" Arthur looked at him, really looked at him. "Whatever they told me to." Travis didn't know what to do with that answer, so he nodded and walked away. But the question was in the air now. Who was this guy? Where had he learned to shoot like that? And why? With all the technology available, was he still using iron sights? The third and final stage was the one that separated competitors from shooters. 500 yards. At that distance, the targets look like postage stamps. With a scope, you can still see what you're aiming at. With iron sights, the front post covers the entire target. You're not aiming at what you can see. You're aiming at what you know is there. It's an act of faith backed by 10,000 hours of practice. The wind had picked up. A crosswind from the left, maybe 8 miles an hour, gusting to 12. The shooters with their weather meters and ballistic calculators were factoring corrections down to a quarter minute of angle. Arthur watched the grass between the firing line and the targets. He watched the mirage shimmer above the ground. He watched the wind flags, not for what they were doing, but for what they were about to do. Reading wind at distance is part science and part intuition. The science can be taught. The intuition takes decades. He loaded his final clip. 8 rounds. The Garand's action locked the bolt forward with that distinctive sound, heavy and mechanical and certain. Arthur settled in. His breathing slowed. His pulse dropped. The world narrowed to 2 points. The front sight post and the space where the target existed behind it. He fired. The recoil of the 30-06 rolled through his shoulder like an old conversation. He didn't fight it. He let it happen. Reset. Breathe. press. Again and again. 8 rounds in 90 seconds. No rush, no wasted motion. While they waited for scores, something unusual was happening near the observation area behind the firing line. A man in civilian clothes had been watching through a high-powered spotting scope. He was in his early 70s, silver hair cut close, posture that looked like it had been set in concrete 40 years ago and never loosened since. He'd arrived quietly during the second stage and had said nothing to anyone, but he'd been watching Lane 12 with an intensity that had nothing to do with casual interest. The final scores posted. And for a moment, the entire range went quiet. Lane 12, 500 yards, group size 3.8 inches, 8 rounds, iron sights, no scope, no rangefinder, no ballistic calculator. Just a 78-year-old man and a rifle that was older than most of the people shooting next to him. His aggregate score across all 3 stages put him in second place overall. Second, against 50 shooters with the best equipment money could buy, and his margin behind first place was less than 2 points. Cody Mercer stared at the board for a long time. He didn't say anything. His friends didn't say anything. There was nothing clever to say. Not anymore. That's when the man from the observation area started walking toward Lane 12. His stride was measured, deliberate, the kind of walk that moves with authority even in blue jeans and a windbreaker. People noticed him without knowing why. Maybe it was the way others unconsciously stepped aside. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, like a man who had spent a lifetime being the most important person in any room he entered, but never felt the need to announce it. He stopped at Lane 12. Arthur was packing his rifle, carefully wiping down the receiver with an oiled cloth. That's an A-position wind hold on your last 3 rounds. You walked them right into the X-ring during the Gus cycle. Arthur's hands stopped. He looked up, and something shifted in his face. Recognition. Not of the man standing in front of him, of the language, of being seen by someone who understood what he had just done and could name it. "Old habit," Arthur said. "Staff Sergeant Devereaux, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, 72 to 75. Arthur stood slowly. "That's right. I'm James Aldridge. I was a captain with 2nd Battalion during the same rotation. Different AO, but I remember your name. You were the one they sent to U City for the marksmanship program after the ceasefire." The people nearby had stopped what they were doing, not because they understood what was being said, because they could feel the weight of it, the way 2 men were looking at each other across 50 years of shared history. Aldridge continued. His voice didn't rise, but it carried across the lane like it was designed to. Arthur Devereaux qualified expert every single year of his service. He was selected for the Marine Corps Competitive Marksmanship Program in 1973, the same program that produced some of the finest precision shooters this country has ever trained. He represented the Marine Corps at Camp Perry 3 times. 3 times. For those of you who don't know, Camp Perry is the national matches, the highest level of rifle competition in the United States. He paused. Let that settle. But that's not why I remember his name. I remember his name because in February of 1975, during one of the last combat advisory missions before the fall of Saigon, Staff Sergeant Devereaux held a position outside a village called Bin Chan with 4 other Marines. They were cut off, no air support, no reinforcements for 9 hours. Devereaux used that rifle, or one just like it, to hold a tree line at ranges between 300 and 500 meters, by himself, for 9 hours. When the relief element finally arrived, they counted the position and understood why the enemy had stopped advancing. 1 man, 1 rifle, iron sights, silence, the kind that has texture to it, the kind you can feel pressing against your chest. Aldridge looked at Cody, then at Cody's friends, then back at Arthur. After that action, Staff Sergeant Devereaux was recommended for the Silver Star. He also received the Bronze Star with Combat V, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device. He served this country for 22 years. He never once needed a scope to find his target. Arthur's jaw was tight. Not from anger, from the weight of hearing your own life summarised in a parking lot by someone who understood what the words actually cost. He looked at Aldridge, and for a moment, both men were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere hot and green and loud, where the stakes were measured in lives, not trophies. Cody stepped forward. His face had changed. The smugness was gone, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Sir, I I said something earlier that I shouldn't have. I didn't know. Arthur looked at him, held the gaze for a moment that stretched. That's the point, son. You didn't know. Nobody ever does. That's why you don't laugh before you've seen the man shoot. Aldridge extended his hand. Arthur took it. The handshake lasted longer than most. Two men who had carried the same weight, wore the same uniform, and understood that some things don't need scopes or software or technology to be measured. Dana, the shooter from Lane 13, was the first to start clapping. It spread. Not the loud, performative kind. The slow, steady kind that builds because people mean it. The kind that comes from the gut, not the hands. The range officer, a retired Marine himself, walked over and shook Arthur's hand. Then he did something that made everyone who knew what it meant stop breathing. He stood at attention, put his heels together, and rendered a salute. Arthur's posture straightened by instinct, decades of muscle memory pulling him upright, and he returned it. Clean, crisp, the way it's supposed to be done. After the awards ceremony, where Arthur received his second-place trophy and a standing ovation that lasted longer than any trophy presentation in the club's history, Cody found him at his truck. Arthur was loading his rifle case into the bed, moving carefully the way men do when their bodies have given more than their fair share. "Sir, would you be willing to teach me? Iron sights, the real way?" Arthur looked at him for a long time, measuring. Not the way you measure an enemy, but the way you measure someone who might be worth your time. "Show up next Saturday, 6 a.m, bring your rifle, leave the scope at home." Cody nodded. "Yes, sir." Arthur climbed into his truck. The engine turned over with the reluctant growl of something that had a lot of miles behind it, and wasn't sure about the ones ahead. He pulled out of the lot, past the rows of shiny trucks and expensive equipment, and turned onto the county road. The next Saturday, Cody was there at 5:45. So was Travis. So were two other young shooters who'd heard what happened. They stood in the cold with bare rifles and waited. Arthur pulled in at 6 sharp. He looked at the group, looked at their rifles, looked at their faces. He nodded once. "First lesson. Forget everything your scope taught you. We start with breath. We start with patience. We start with seeing what's actually there, not what a computer tells you is there." And for the first time in a long time, young men listened to an old man, not because they were told to, because they'd watched him prove, in front of everyone, that some things can only be learned the hard way, the slow way, the way that doesn't come with a battery or a warranty. The quietest skill is usually the deepest, and the steadiest hands often belong to those who've been through the most. If this story hit you in the chest, wait until you hear what happened when a retired Navy SEAL was turned away from a Veterans Day ceremony at his own grandson's school. What the principal didn't know would change school policy permanently. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of the heroes who walk among us unrecognized. Comment, "Ion Sights," if you believe real skill can't be bought off a shelf, and hit that like button if you think the men and women who served deserve our respect, whether we know their story or not.